The morning Mara Dellen was fired, the sky over the palace of Esterholm was a clean, pale blue. The kind of sky that feels like it belongs to someone else, not to a girl who had spent 6 years scrubbing marble floors and pressing royal linens before dawn. She stood in the great hall with her hands folded in front of her back straight, and her face calm, even though her heart was doing something terrible inside her chest. King Aldrich Vane did not look at her. He never looked at the servants directly, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. He was a tall man with dark, tired eyes, and the kind of jaw that always looked like it was holding something back. He sat in his chair at the head of the long table, and he listened as his head steward, a thin, careful man named Crowan, read the charges aloud. The accused, Mara Dellen, palace maid of the East Wing, is charged with the theft of a gilded candelabra from the West Gallery. The item has been missing since Tuesday last. Several witnesses have placed her near the gallery on the evening in question. Mara said, quietly and clearly, that she did not take it. No one in the room moved. Crowan looked at the paper in his hands, instead of at her. A junior footman near the door studied his shoes. The king tapped one finger slowly on the arm of his chair. The candelabra has not been recovered, Crowan continued. In light of this, and in accordance with palace protocol, dismissal is recommended. The king signed the order. He used a black pen. It took 3 seconds. Mara watched his hand move across the paper and understood that this was how lives changed, not with shouting or storms, but with a quiet scratch of ink. She was escorted out of the palace before noon. A guard walked with her to the iron gate. She carried a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and, in her other hand, a small locked wooden box. Plain, old, the wood slightly darker where hands had touched it over the years. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had worked in that same palace for 40 years and passed away 6 months ago, leaving behind almost nothing except that box and a request. Give this to the one it belongs to. Mara had not known what that meant. She still did not. The gate closed behind her with a sound like a full stop. 2 days passed. Inside the palace, a junior archivist named Pell was assigned to catalog the now empty servant quarters in the East Wing. It was dull work. He moved from room to room with a clipboard, noting the condition of furniture, checking for items left behind. When he reached the small room at the end of the corridor, Mara's room, he found it very clean. She had always been that kind of person. He checked under the cot as a matter of routine, running his hand along the edge of the floor. His fingers found a gap in the boards, a loose square of wood, barely noticeable unless you were looking. He pressed it. It gave. Beneath it was a hollow the size of a shoebox, and inside that hollow was something wrapped tightly in old velvet cloth, the color of which had faded from deep red to something closer to brown. Pell unwrapped it slowly. He had to sit down on the floor when he saw what it was. The royal crown of Esterholm, the crown that had belonged to the late Queen Mother, the crown that had vanished 11 years ago, the night she died, and had never been found, despite searches that lasted months, an official inquiry, and years of quiet grief. Pell ran. Not walked. Ran. King Aldrich was in his study when the crown was brought to him. He did not speak for a long time after they placed it on the desk in front of him. He simply looked at it. The gold was dull from age but unharmed. The stones, emeralds and a single large diamond at the center, were cloudy with dust but intact. It looked smaller than he remembered. He had last seen it on his mother's head when he was 17 years old, on the evening of a state dinner, 2 hours before she collapsed in her chamber and never woke up. He picked it up with both hands. It was lighter than he expected, or maybe he was just older and stronger now. He sat there with it for a very long time. Then he looked up at Crowan, who stood in the doorway. "Who was assigned to the East Wing the night my mother died?" the king asked. It was a simple question, the kind that sounds ordinary until the room suddenly becomes very still. Crowan's expression did not change, exactly. But something shifted behind his eyes. Just a flicker, like a candle flame when a door opens nearby. "I would need to consult the records," he said. "Then consult them," the king said. The palace records from 11 years ago were stored in the lower archive. It took an hour to find the right ledger. The name written in the column beside East Wing Night Duty on the date in question was not Mara Dellen. It was Nola Dellen, her grandmother. a woman who had served the palace faithfully for 4 decades and had died quietly in that very room 6 months ago, leaving behind almost nothing. The king read the name twice. Then he thought about the small wooden box Mara had been carrying the day she left. He thought about it very carefully. Within the hour, 2 palace guards were sent to find Mara Dellen. She opened the door of the small apartment she was staying in. She was living with a cousin on the other side of the city, and she looked at the guards with the calm, careful face of someone who has learned not to show fear to people in uniforms. She came with them without asking many questions. She brought the wooden box because they asked her to, though she did not know why. They brought her to a small room off the main corridor, not the great hall this time. The king was already there. Crowan was not. Aldrich held out the letter to her without explanation. She sat down, and she read it. It was written in her grandmother's handwriting, careful, old-fashioned letters that slanted slightly to the left. The ink had faded a little at the edges, but was still perfectly clear in the middle of each line, the way important things always manage to stay readable. The letter said this: "On the night the Queen passed, I was cleaning the corridor outside her chamber. I heard a sound and went in to check. The Queen had already fallen. I called for help immediately. But before the others arrived, I saw the crown on the floor near her chair. It had fallen, or been placed there. I did not know which. In the confusion that followed, I was afraid. I was an old woman from a small village, and I was holding the crown of the kingdom in my hands, and I knew what it would look like. I hid it. I told myself it was only temporary. I told myself I would return it when things calmed down. But things never calmed down. The inquiry began. People were questioned. I became more afraid, not less. And so the days became weeks, and the weeks became years, and I carried this secret until it became heavier than I could manage. I have left the crown where I hid it, in the room where I spent the last years of my life. I am sorry. I was afraid. I hope someone will understand that fear is not the same as evil, and that a person can do a wrong thing for a reason that is not wicked. I am sorry to the king, who loved his mother. I am sorry to Mara, who will have to carry this letter when I cannot carry it any longer." Mara finished reading. She folded the letter very carefully along its original creases. Then she set it down on the table and pressed her palm flat against it, the way you do when you want to hold something still. Her eyes were full, but she did not cry. Not yet. The king watched her. He had been watching her face the whole time she read, and what he saw there was not guilt or calculation. It was grief. Pure, clean grief. The grief of someone who has just learned something about a person they loved, something that explains a lot of small mysteries, and also breaks your heart a little at the same time. "You did not know," the king said. "It was not a question." "No," Mara said. "She never told me anything about it. She never spoke about that night at all." There was a pause. "The candelabra," the king said then. "You did not take it either." "No," she said again. The king nodded slowly. He had already begun to suspect this. Palace investigators had been quietly reviewing Crowan's record since the night before, not because of the candelabra, but because of a much older and more important question. What they were finding was not good. Crowan had filed the report against Mara himself. The supposed witnesses he had named could not be located. The candelabra, it turned out, had never actually been missing. It had been moved to a storage room for polishing and recorded incorrectly. The charge against Mara had been built out of very little, by a man who had very specific reasons for wanting her gone from the palace, before the East Wing rooms were cleaned and catalogued. What those reasons were exactly, whether Crowan had known about the crown all along, or had merely suspected, or had simply been covering for himself in some other way, was still being untangled, but the shape of it was becoming clear. "I owe you an apology," the king said. He said it simply, without drama or ceremony, in the same tone he might use to correct a mistake in a document. Mara looked at him. She had not expected that. In her experience, kings did not apologize to maids. "Your name will be cleared," he continued. "Formally, in the palace record, I want there to be no confusion about what happened or who is to blame for it." He paused, then said something that surprised even him as he said it. "Your grandmother served this palace honestly for 40 years. She made one frightened mistake late in her life. I think she spent a long time punishing herself for it. I do not intend to punish her further. Mara pressed her lips together. She nodded once. Crowan was removed from his post that same evening. He was escorted from the palace under the watch of 2 senior officers, his face arranged into an expression of calm dignity that fooled no one. A full investigation was opened. The details of it would take months to work through, but the first and most important facts were already clear. The crown was brought to the palace chapel and placed on the altar, not for display, but because someone had once told the king that things which have been lost for a long time deserve a quiet moment before they are put back into their proper place. He went in alone and stood there for a while. He thought about his mother. He thought about an old woman scrubbing floors at midnight, holding a crown and being too afraid to speak. He thought about how long the consequences of a single moment of fear could travel, how they could cross years and generations, and land finally in the hands of a young woman who had nothing to do with any of it. The next morning, the king had Mara formally reinstated. Her name was added back to the palace roll, with a note beside it that said, simply, cleared of all charges, reinstated with full standing. A palace spokesperson issued a brief public statement acknowledging that a maid had been wrongfully dismissed and that the matter had been corrected. It did not say much, but it said enough. Mara returned to the palace on a Thursday. She came in through the front entrance, which was not the usual entrance for staff. No one had specifically told her to do it that way. She simply decided, that morning, that she had earned it. She walked through the tall front doors with her canvas bag over one shoulder, and her head level, and her steps quiet on the marble floor, and she went to her work. She was not assigned to the East Wing anymore. She was given a different post, closer to the center of the palace, where the important rooms were. It was not a promotion exactly, but it was also not nothing. The wooden box she kept. There was nothing left inside it now, except the letter, and a small pressed flower, a violet, dry and papery, that her grandmother had placed between the folded sheets. Mara did not know what it meant. Some things, she decided, do not need to mean anything. Some things are just what someone chose to put there, in the dark, before the end. The royal crown of Esterholm was cleaned and returned to the palace vault, where it was catalogued and locked away with the rest of the kingdom's history. There was no ceremony. The king did not make a speech. Sometimes the most important things end quietly, without announcement, tucked back into their proper places by ordinary hands. The crown had been missing for 11 years. It came home because a grandmother wrote a letter she was afraid to send while she was living, and because a young woman carried a box she did not understand, and because a king was willing to drive himself across a city in the early morning, without a guard or an escort, looking for the truth instead of waiting for someone else to bring it to him. That is how it ended, not with thunder, with a letter, a locked box, and a very long silence that finally, gently, broke.